I'm 79 years old, and I want to tell you something that most people spend their entire lives getting wrong about loss. They think grief is something you survive. They think the goal is to get through it, to come out the other side, to eventually stop feeling the weight of what you've lost. But that's not how it works. That's never been how it works. And the verses, the words that have carried human beings through the darkest moments of their lives, they don't promise you a way out. They promise you something far more powerful than that. Loss is not a problem to be solved. This is the first thing the great sacred texts understood, that we, in our modern hunger for remedies and solutions, keep forgetting. The book of Psalms does not open with an answer. It opens with a cry. But God, my God, why have you forsaken me? And what's extraordinary about that line, what most people completely miss, is that it wasn't written as a question expecting a response. It was written as a declaration that the experience of abandonment, the experience of feeling utterly alone in your suffering, is itself a sacred act. To cry out is already to be in conversation with something larger than yourself. This is where grief begins, not in acceptance, not in healing, but in the audacity of the cry. In the verses that truly carry people through loss are the ones that honor that cry first before they offer anything else. But it goes even deeper than that. There is a reason why the 23rd Psalm has been spoken at more bedsides, more gravesides, more moments of unbearable human pain than almost any other sequence of words in the recorded history of language. Most people think it's comforting because it talks about green pastures and still waters, about rest and restoration. They hear it as a poem about peace. And yes, it is that. But the real power is in the valley. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. The power is in that single word, through, not around, not above, not spared from, through. The verse doesn't say you won't enter the valley. It doesn't promise you the valley won't be dark. It says you walk through it, and that you're not alone while you walk. That is an entirely different kind of comfort than what people usually look for. People look for reassurance that the pain will end. The verse offers something more honest and ultimately more sustaining. The assurance that the pain is not the end. There is a difference, and it matters enormously. And here's what most people miss about those ancient elegies, those funeral poems, those lines from Job and Lamentations and the Gospel of John. They were not written by people who had never suffered. They were written by people who had lost everything and still found language for it. Job did not receive easy answers. He received a whirlwind. And in the whirlwind, something shifted, not because his suffering was explained, but because he was witnessed. He was seen in his pain by something immense and undeniable. The verse that endures is not the one that explains suffering. It is the one that says, I see you in yours. Jesus wept. 2 words, the shortest verse in the Christian Bible. And yet those 2 words have done more work in the architecture of human consolation than entire theological libraries. Why? Because they say something that no doctrine can fully contain. They say that the divine, whatever you understand that to mean, does not stand apart from grief. It enters it. It weeps inside it. The verse doesn't say Jesus explained death to Mary and Martha. It doesn't say he immediately fixed the situation, even though the story goes on to say he did. First, he wept. First, he stood in the grief with them. That sequence is everything. The order matters. Presence before solution. Grief honored before grief healed. This is what the verses know that we keep having to relearn. Now go even deeper into this. The Islamic tradition carries a phrase repeated at moments of loss, Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un, which translates roughly as, indeed, we belong to God, and indeed to Him we shall return. Most Westerners hear this and think it is a statement of resignation, a kind of theological surrender, but that's a surface reading. The real depth of that verse is in its grammar. It speaks in the present tense about belonging, not we belonged, not we will belong, abs. We belong. Right now, in this moment of loss, in this moment where the ground has been ripped from under your feet, you belong to something. You are not untethered. You cannot be untethered. The loss itself is happening inside a belonging that cannot be lost. That is the hidden architecture of consolation. And it appears across traditions, across centuries, across every culture that has ever tried to put language to the experience of death and loss and grief. The Navajo speak of walking in beauty, and the beauty way does not avoid suffering. It walks through it with a kind of ceremonial attention, a refusal to look away, an honoring of the difficulty as part of the wholeness of existence. The Buddhist texts offer impermanence not as a cold fact but as a liberation. What is subject to arising is also subject to ceasing, and in that symmetry, something breathes. Nothing is stuck, not even the grief. But here is where the verses become truly practical. And this is the part that I have watched work in real human lives over many decades. The function of these words is not primarily intellectual. You don't read them to understand them, you read them to be carried by them. There is a physiological reality to this. When the nervous system is overwhelmed by loss, when the body is moved into the kind of shock that grief produces, the rational mind cannot access what it needs. Ordinary language fails. But these verses, worn smooth by centuries of human grief, they move differently. They bypass the desperate thinking mind and go somewhere older, somewhere deeper. They enter through the breath, through the cadence, through the repetition. This is why people who cannot remember what you said to them at a funeral will remember a verse you read. This is why the words come back to them at 3 in the morning when nothing else will hold. The verse is not just meaning, it is structure, it is rhythm. It is a shape that the mind can rest inside when it cannot hold its own shape anymore. The practical application of this is simpler than most people expect. You don't need to believe the theology of a verse for it to carry you. You don't need to be religious to let Psalm 46 work in your body. Be still and know that I am God. You can read that as a theological statement and it will mean one thing. Or you can read it as an instruction in nervous system regulation, and it will mean something equally true and perhaps more immediately accessible. Be still. No, those are not just words. They are a practice. They are a direction for the overwhelmed mind. The verse asks you to stop before you know, to be still first, and in the stillness, something like knowing becomes possible. Not certainty, not the end of grief, but an orientation, a sense that there is ground under you even when you cannot feel it. Rumi's reed flute poem begins with longing, with separation, with the cry of something cut from its source. And it has carried Persian-speaking people through grief for 8 centuries because it names something true. The longing itself is the connection. The ache of absence is a form of presence. The verse doesn't heal the wound by closing it. It heals it by revealing that the wound is where the light gets in, to borrow from a more recent poet who understood the same ancient truth. So, when you are with someone in loss and you reach for these words, don't reach for the ones that promise comfort too quickly. Don't reach for the verses that skip the valley. Reach for the ones that say, I see the depth of this. I see the darkness of this, and I am here with you in it. The verses that carry people are the ones that have the courage to be honest before they offer hope. To grieve first, to witness first, to say, this is real and it is heavy, and you're not wrong to feel the weight of it. Because the final truth, the deepest layer, is this. Loss is not a detour from life. It is the proof of love. And every verse that has ever carried a human being through their darkest hour has known this at its center. You grieve in proportion to how much you loved. The grief is not the opposite of the love. It is the love continuing and the only form available to it now. And when you find the words for that, when you let yourself speak that truth, or when you let an ancient verse speak it through you, something shifts. Not because the pain disappears, but because the pain is finally understood for what it truly is. And in that understanding, you find you can breathe again. You find you can take the next step. You find that the valley, however long it takes to walk through, does indeed have another side. And there is one more thing I need to tell you, one more layer that almost no one reaches, because it requires sitting with the discomfort long enough to discover it. The verses that get people through loss are not just medicine for the moment of acute grief. They are training for what comes after. Because loss does not end, it transforms. The sharp agony of the first weeks becomes something different over months and years. Something that lives in you differently. Something that you carry rather than something that carries you. And the verses shift with you in that transformation. Ecclesiastes says there's a time for everything. A time to be born and a time to die. A time to mourn and a time to dance. What that verse is doing is giving loss its proper place in the rhythm of existence, not as an interruption to life, but as one of its seasons. And seasons end, not because you forced them to, not because you healed yourself through sheer effort or the right combination of wellness practices, but because time, actual time, moves things. The verse trusts time. It asks you to trust time with it. And the dance that comes after mourning is not a betrayal of the person you lost. This is something that widows and widowers and parents who have buried children have told me across many years. The guilt of moving forward, the fear that laughing again means forgetting, and the sense that joy is somehow disloyal. The verses know this territory too. They have always known it, because every person who ever wrote a lament eventually also wrote a psalm. The same David who wrote, "How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever?" also wrote, "I will sing to the Lord, for he has been good to me." Not because the grief was gone, because grief and gratitude can live in the same breath, because the human heart is larger than any single emotion, because love does not only grieve, it also celebrates. It also remembers with joy what it once had the extraordinary privilege of holding. The verse that gives you permission to feel both things at once is the one that truly frees you. Not the verse that says grief is over. The verse that says grief and joy are not enemies. They are the two notes of the same song, the song of having loved something deeply in a world where nothing lasts forever. And to have loved something deeply in a world where nothing lasts forever is not a tragedy. It is the whole point. It is everything. It is the only thing worth having been here for at all. That is what the verses know. That is what they have always known. And that is why, after all these centuries, after all the particular losses and particular griefs of every particular human life that has ever been lived, they still work. Because they are not about the grief. They are about the love that made the grief possible. And love, even in the most ancient texts, even in the most honest corners of every sacred tradition that has ever tried to speak to the human condition, love is the one thing that does not end.